Tragic developments on both sides of the Atlantic. She said she's from South Ossetia. She's like, oh wow, Georgia, I've never been. That's so interesting. And she's like, no, we're our own country. Russia recognized us.
People live in different realities, and we might not always know about it.
We're going to lose. There's no hope whatsoever.
More people need to hear about this. Thank you for tuning in. This is Khetavan Ჭინჭarաძე, my first podcast, and my very first guest, Marlis, a dual national American, German, and a wonderful young professional in the space of politics and international relations in Washington, D.C. So I'm very excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this.
And I think people might want to know why you're the first guest of the first podcast, whose name I don't have yet. And I'd like to encourage audience to actually give me advice. What should I name my podcast? You were the one who inspired me to do this. So we met in Miami. We had such wonderful conversations. We became fast friends. We had so many things in common, and the conversations of the world, really. I mean, all sorts of issues. And I thought to myself, you know what? More people need to hear about this. More people need to know that there are young people like us out there trying to solve great issues of our time.
I so appreciate being here, and I can just give that back. I think nowadays there's so much going on, and it does give me hope when I have conversations that inspire me and I get to hear different perspectives like yours.
We have a lot to discuss today.
A lot has happened, not just in the last few weeks, but especially in the last few days. And I'm sure by the time this episode is up, a lot more will have happened, but we'll tackle it issue by issue.
Let's dive right into it. America has the second woman who's a presidential candidate, but the first woman who is a person of color against Donald Trump. Your thoughts? How do we feel about this?
I think most Democrats, most progressives felt an immense sense of relief when Joe Biden's statement came out on Sunday. I think the last few weeks after the presidential debate, President Biden did not do well at all. I think there was so much chaos, essentially, in the Democratic Party, or at least that's what it seemed like. And essentially there was a sense of, we can't win this if Joe Biden is our candidate, right? And Trump was leading in polls in all swing states at the time. And after the debate, obviously, he did a lot better even in the polls than he did before. So I think when news hit on Sunday, which I think was kind of one of those historic moments, I think most people will remember where they were, what they were doing when news hit. I actually
don't remember what was I doing.
Okay, come on. Okay, let's do it. Most Americans. I was sitting in a restaurant with family friends, and the waiter told us, and it was interesting because I felt my iPhone buzzing in my purse, with the push notifications coming in and messages reaching me, and I ignored it because I was at a restaurant. And then the waiter walked up and was like, oh, Biden just dropped out. And I was like, oh, wow. So big moment.
Expected, but kind of not expected.
Let's say it this way. I think claiming that this was to be expected is kind of a stretch, because I think, it really took a while after the presidential debate for anything to happen. I think it was more of a concern that if it doesn't happen, we're going to lose. It was essentially this is the last chance we have. They need to push Kamala, or whatever the thing was. It was just, there was this need for change. There was a need for someone to step up and essentially present a plan, fight. A political party is there to fight for a vision, to fight for the people. And I think right after the debate and up to the very moment that Joe endorsed Kamala as a new presidential candidate for the Democrats, there was just this sense of, we're going to lose. There's no hope whatsoever.
I actually remember that I got that news from my uncle in Georgia before my New York Times notification came in. It was probably a second before.
And that shows you that the whole world is watching.
Absolutely. It is not only the U.S. news. I think the whole world is watching closely, particularly this race.
Yes.
Donald Trump, again, against America's possibly the first colored woman president. What are her chances?
Well, it's only been a few days, right? So I think as of right now, we can't really speak to a specific platform that she has, right? She's still part of the Biden administration right now. She's still our vice president. So in this function, we can basically just judge what she's been doing these last years, what she said on record on different issues. But I do think there has been a change in narrative to the extent that, before people kept mentioning she did horribly in her campaign back then when she was running against Biden, right? People like to bring that up, and that she was very, very unpopular as a vice president.
But that was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago, but I think because she was very unpopular as a vice president, that kind of stuck with her. People point that out, it's kind of like a self-perpetuating kind of situation. And essentially, I think what we see now is that there's so much enthusiasm, so much hope, without being able to predict the outcome of the elections, but there's a momentum right now in this country where people feel like it's no longer a choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, these two people that no one was enthusiastic about, right? No one was enthusiastic about these two old men that we already have seen compete against each other previously, stepping up to do the same thing again. So I think, she's younger, which of course is a huge advantage for her because now they can't use that. Now Trump is the old candidate. Essentially she has a chance to rebrand herself, and I think that's already happening. I think anyone who's on social media, right, TikTok, Instagram, there's a lot of trends.
Oh, young people love her.
They love her.
TikTok is saturated by Kamala Harris.
I was going to say the fan edits are crazy, right? There's so many different things going around. She's being quoted for funny phrases she has used, which make her look very charismatic. People relate to it. You've probably heard of Charlie XCX's Brat album, which is being used. Kamala is Brat.
And Beyonce's song.
Yeah, right. No. She says she can use the Freedom Song.
I totally agree with you. Living in Washington, D.C., I could feel how it flipped in 24 hours. Even less. The moment Kamala was announced to be a presidential candidate, people were like, wow, we need to support her. She needs to win. And I admit, I was one of those people who thought that she did not have a chance, that Joe Biden was a much better choice, and Kamala had no chance to win against Donald Trump. But the atmosphere right now in the United States has convinced me otherwise. I think you're 100% right. Kamala as vice president is totally different from Kamala a presidential candidate.
How does your family back home? You said you heard about this through a message that you got from
my uncle.
Your uncle.
Yeah.
How did they view this? What is their take on what's going on? Is this positive? Are they concerned? I had a friend that reached out to me and she said, "Oh, suddenly things are getting so interesting." And I was like, "What are you talking about? It's been very interesting for us the entire time." But I see that, abroad things might look very differently now.
That is a very interesting question, because I think everyone back home, opposition or position, have been flirting with the Republican Party because Trump was considered such a strong contender against Joe Biden. And I don't think people abroad, especially in my country, thought that Joe Biden was going to get reelected. Mm-hmm. But I am not sure how that is going to change going forward.
Okay.
I still see that trend to continue a little bit, but more poll results will come and people will redirect their policies as they always do. I think the general sensation from what I've heard is that America might not be ready for a black woman president. I think having a vice president who is still a white man is a very wise and strategic choice by both sides. Mm-hmm. Because, when you're approaching this campaign, you need to be thinking strategically in terms of what kind of voters you can get and what kind of voters you can attract. So I don't see two women on the same ticket winning the whole election.
No. So what do you think of the vice presidential candidates? Anything that stood out, shocked you, scared you?
I actually want to hear from you. Nothing has shocked me. I think those are the candidates, logical, governors, white middle-aged men. Again, I think the question now is who? Which one of them? Mm-hmm. What do you think?
So I I don't want to go ahead and say who I think it could be, because I think...
Be careful.
I was going to say, you never know what's going to happen.
Probably by the time we release this podcast, we will know
who is
the vice presidential candidate.
Yes. That's why I would not dare to go that far. At this point, while we're recording this, right, there's multiple governors and Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona. Of course, like strategically speaking, if you want to engage voters that Biden might have not been able to mobilize for this election, you need the independents, you need all the undecided voters, you might need the younger generation, you might need Arab Americans who have decided to skip the top of the ballot because of the Israel-Hamas, Israel-Gaza issue. So there's multiple groups, like demographic groups, essentially, that we're going to sit out this election, who would usually vote Democratic, who now she has a chance to bring back in. And I think, like, one big advantage, of course, of someone like Senator Mark Kelly is, of course, he's from Arizona, which is a border state, which, of course, immigration is a huge issue for Republican voters, but also for a lot of independents, not so much for Democrats, but, people
but it's still an issue
because,
majority are concerned about it.
Yeah, and it affects the entire country, right? She would run with someone such as Mark Kelly, right, who has managed to win in a swing state where the biggest group of voters are registered independents, right? So he's already shown that he has managed to do the impossible. So I think swing states are something uniquely American, at least from what I know. So essentially, most people in the U.S. vote for the party. They always do. We have a two-party system, right? So if you're a registered Republican, you'll probably wind up voting Republican, and if you're a registered Democrat, you'll wind up voting for the Democrats. However, essentially, our presidential elections are decided by 6 states that tend to swing back and forth, right? They're not a clear red or blue, they're purple states.
Right.
So it's just something to observe and keep an eye on. But essentially, that's where they need to campaign the strongest. Those are the battleground states. Like, it comes down to a few 100,000 people they need to convince in order to win the top of the ticket. So it's a very unique phenomenon, and Arizona is definitely one of the swing states. But there's other picks. So Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, he has the unique perspective that he's progressive and Christian, which, of course, in the South, like, winning a progressive victory in a very Christian society, of course, is a huge win. So I think all the picks out there right now, and of course there's multiple other governors as well.
And just to clarify, the southern states in the United States tend to vote Republican and tend to be Christian.
Yes, especially the rural side, right? So there are blue pockets in
right.
most
There
of the
are.
states, but overall, yes.
Like the swing states we just talked about, like Arizona, Georgia.
And even in some of the very Republican states, right? There's some very, very blue cities, but overall, yes.
Right.
Very clearly red-leaning.
And I think Trump's campaign is going to have a hard time figuring out how to attack Kamala Harris. I think a lot of people are underestimating her. I was one of them, and I admit.
I mean, it's so fresh right now. It's just a few days ago, so I don't essentially know right now how they're going to attack her.
They're probably thinking about their strategy as we speak.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And, I think everyone's also just very curious and excited to see how Kamala is going to rebrand herself right now.
Forward to that.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward
I think it'll
to
be
that.
very, very interesting.
So, this is the election year, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. Did you vote in the European Parliament elections too?
I sure did. I had my ballot sent here and sent it back.
Well, then I need to ask you about the results. The European Parliament is now more right-wing than ever. Mm-hmm. Right-wing is on the rise in Europe, and frankly in the United States too, with Trump leading the polls yet. So how do you feel about it? Tell us a little bit about the European Union Parliament elections. And I also want to hear how it went in Germany particularly.
Yeah, tragic developments on both sides of the Atlantic. Things are looking up here right now. I mean, I think no one was surprised by the results. The far right had been doing very well, at least in Germany. I can't speak for every European Union member country. But overall, we're seeing a lot of populists gain power in Europe over the last years. So, working in the progressive bubble, I knew that the conservatives were going to definitely gain a lot more power, and I was pretty sure the far right was going to do very well, and then they did. I think it points at how unhappy a lot of people are and how many people feel like maybe kitchen table issues are not being solved, because I essentially think that that's where the far right often taps into. You know, that's where they can really win people over. And yeah, looking at Germany, I mean, it was quite devastating to see the results. I mean, essentially, the far right did very well, especially our generation, like the 16 to 35-year-olds voted for them in like a huge part, which is shocking. Well, not even that surprising, I guess. There's like two very different trends going on in our generation, right? There's a very progressive movement, and then there's a movement that wants to go back to more traditional, more stable times. And I also think the East-West divide is definitely something interesting.
Oh, I want to hear more about that.
Well, so I'm on my German side.
Is there still this
the Iron Curtain?
Imaginary Berlin Wall between the East and the West?
If you look at the election results, that's essentially what you can see. So the Eastern German states very strongly voted for the far right.
Very strongly.
So if you look at, if you like color all the different regions in Germany after like what they voted for, like Eastern Germany, like collectively voted for the far right. And they've been very strong over the last years. We've been seeing this in different elections, and we have upcoming elections in September and October in the Eastern German states, like at a national, like state level. A lot of people are looking at the European Parliament election results as an indicator for what's to come. But it can be different, right? I think we often see this at the national level, people will vote, or like, let's say it this way, if the far right did very well in the European Parliament elections, that doesn't necessarily mean all national elections are going to wind up the same way.
And I think we saw that when Macron called the snap elections and Marine Le Pen thought that she was going to win, and she was doing very well in the first round, but...
Crazy move on behalf of Macron. I would just like to put that out there.
And then everybody was like, whoa, what is happening? We don't want this lady leading our parliamentary majority. So I think a lot of voters just got out the vote, and now the majority is actually liberal progressive.
Yeah, the French came through for us. They're really good at mobilizing people to go out and protest and demonstrate. So when these things happen, that's what the French do, and they do that well. So that was a small success. And also Labour in the UK, we're seeing small progressive successes.
Why do you think there is such a divide between the East and the West of Germany still?
So that's a very big question. And, I need to put the disclaimer in that on my German side, my family is from former Western Germany. I lived in all kind of different parts in Germany, also in Berlin, which was in the East. But, overall, I grew up in the West. But I have a lot of friends from Eastern Germany, and I've spoken about this with them a lot over the last years. And it's interesting because, like, economically speaking, after Germany was united, people who lived in former East Germany were better off. Like, the numbers speak for them being better off. However, of course, there was still a lot of inequality going on, right? There was wages that needed to be adjusted, right? There was not a lot of industry, like even nowadays. I mean, now we have a lot of big headquarters of big companies coming in, but essentially that took a very long time. Obviously, you see these results. So there must be some narrative prevalent that is keeping people from feeling like Germany has actually united. There is something that makes them feel like they still have a different identity, right? And
do you think communism has to do anything with it? Those leftovers here and there in older generations?
I definitely think there's a nostalgic aspect to it.
That's very interesting.
In the older generation.
What do they miss?
Well, again, right, I'm from Western Germany, so I don't even want to necessarily speak for that because I feel like, it's not my place. But I mean, you're Georgian.
That's why I'm asking. I wanted to have
more of these conversations about nostalgia and the Soviet Union than I
100%. And I think Georgians are also, I don't want to speak in the name of majority, but there definitely are some Georgians who are even proud of Stalin, because not many people might know that Stalin was actually a Georgian man, and people are proud that the world had the greatest politician, if not the greatest, one of the greatest politicians who was actually born in our country. And
great meaning big and powerful,
oh,
not great.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's debatable, you know. Some people do think he was politically and personally great. Some people think he was the worst enemy of the mankind, and we shouldn't be proud of him.
So what is the nostalgic aspect for for your parents' generation, for instance? What are they like? Is it just yearning back for a time where a very prominent, powerful figure was from Georgia and maybe part of the Russian Empire, right? Was it that, or is it also just day-to-day life? What is it like? Are there specific
That's a very interesting formulation of the question, because I don't think anyone in Georgia misses being part of the Russian Empire, being part of this great Soviet nation. I think they just miss the comfort of life. They miss having food, jobs, and not worry about them, because you have the government arranging everything for you. You have childcare, you have maternity leave. Nobody's unemployed. There's no such thing as unemployment, right? They would actually chase people down who were not working because the perception was that you were going to contribute to your country. So the nostalgia is really about economic well-being and easy lifestyle, as opposed to, we should be part of the Russian Empire. Actually, Georgians are very proud. We're a very proud nation. Part of it has to that we are a small nation and we had to survive over centuries. So we've developed this self-fulfillment and appreciation of our deep culture, history, everything, and preservation of centuries-long work that our ancestors did to get us here, right? So in that sense, we want to be independent, and we don't value anything more than our independence as a country and as a nation. There's also this paradox that older generations particularly don't really realize that they still carry a bit of Soviet Union within them. I always say that the Soviet Union has not broken up yet. It will take generations to take the Soviet Union out of people, but we took people out of the Soviet Union overnight, right? It is definitely going to take time, and there's this big generational divide in my country and in the wider post-Soviet space. Me and my generation and younger generations who are born in an independent country, we have social media, we grew up on Hollywood movies and Western pop songs. We just cannot think the way my parents do and their parents do.
But I think that's such an important and interesting point. And I think this is also something that Eastern Germany went through, right? There's people who have seen different systems, who have lived under different system and regimes, who know how things can be different and have a comparison. But then you have generations that are born into a system that spend their whole childhood, adolescence, being young adults in a system where, they live their lives and they just have their day-to-day lives and they have friends and hobbies, and maybe things are not great. And maybe you know that, or maybe you don't know that because you're not, back then we did not have social media. Back then, right? Yes, of course, I know that a lot of Western and US culture, music, whatnot, obviously made waves also in the Soviet Union. People were aware, but, I think there was also a space to not be involved in that, and I think a lot of what you just said probably resonates with a lot of people out there, which is the wall falls, right? And people tell you, oh, well, you've been saved. Here's the triumphant system.
I don't think people actually appreciated the fact that, oh my God, the wall is down, the Soviet Union is gone, now we're free. I don't think they viewed us this way.
And I think it was, in many ways, at least, accompanied by a feeling of, you've been saved, a better system is here, right? I think often capitalism has triumphed, and the West, we're united, blah, blah. I think it's tough for some people to hear that if you didn't feel like your life was that bad, right? And I think, because that's what you knew. And I think it's the same for many people worldwide in different situations. If you would just tell them, oh, things were so bad, and you live in this fascist regime, and even if that is the fact, you don't want to probably necessarily hear that. I think your first reaction is probably more defensive because you did have good memories, perhaps. Maybe you associate that life with your family and your friends, and suddenly someone's telling you, oh, well, thank God that's over, right? So I wonder if that's part of the narrative that you say, that a part of the Soviet Union rests in former Soviet Union countries. and will take generations.
The thing is, what you just said is probably one of the major criticisms of American foreign policy for decades. Because, you know, a lot of times as Westerners, particularly Americans, had more prominent presence all around the world, come to you and tell you, oh, we know what's better. Democracy is the best kind of governance. This is the only way. Therefore, we know you don't, because we've been doing democracy for a long time and you're new to this game.
Yes.
And I don't think a lot of people appreciate that. A lot of governments, a lot of nations, because nobody likes to be told that they are stupid and they need to shut up and listen to you. Yeah. And that's basically what it sounds like.
And that's also where countries such as Russia or China are getting a lot of allies right now, because, you know, I think it's one thing to go abroad and say these things, but then not be able to deliver on them, right? I think there's also, if you selectively implement certain things, Iraq was, you know, a prime example of how we did not live up to these values that we're telling countries, like, oh, democracy, oh, you know, human rights, and then Iraq happens. And it's one of numerous examples, right? And of course, I think no nation in the world ever properly delivers on all its promises and manages to follow through on its values. But I agree, by doing that, you lose credibility. It just doesn't sit right with people when you come in and you tell them your system isn't working. So
it becomes one of the centerpieces of anti-Western propaganda.
Yeah.
Because look at how Russians and the Chinese are running their narratives. Russians are telling you, oh my God, you're so great. You've been so great. And we've been so great together under the Soviet Union. You still hold those amazing values. We still value your values. But look at the West.
Yeah.
They're coming to your country, trying to alleviate your culture. They're imposing their liberal rules on you. And this word liberalism has become such a bad word. It's almost offensive when somebody tells you, oh, you are a liberal.
Yeah. Well, also what I think is interesting about what you just said is I've seen this, like, you know, in the bubble I work in, we have some programs that also work with countries from the global south, and we connect people in the transatlantic bubble, both from Europe and the US, with partners in the global south to have a dialogue about these things. And it's interesting because essentially criticism that we hear from partners is people from the West come, right? The West, like meaning the construct, instead of wanting to talk about relations with the global south at large, or how to help with development, or, you know, what is beneficial to this relationship that they have, they want to talk about China. And like, why are you in our country here to talk about China, which is, you know, the competitor for the US, for the West? It's, you know, and essentially like, I thought you're here to talk about our problems, about how we can work together. And China comes in and China has those conversations with them about what they need. Infrastructure, you know, loans. I mean, there's a lot there. And so I think that's very interesting because it's become very apparent in conversations.
I agree with that. I talk a lot about China on my YouTube channel because I feel like there is this gap in the Georgian society. We don't know enough China, and it is our strategic partner. So I try to cater to my audience and tell them what's going on around the world. But a lot of Westerners are criticizing China and the nations who are aligning with China, you know, and I don't see practical actions taken to offer those countries to advance their economies and their political and social well-being while China is doing it, you know. Don't show up with a criticism, show up with practical cooperation tools. Yeah,
I actually know it's interesting because, you know, again, I'm a dual citizen, and on the American side, you know, China and the US obviously work together in a lot of things, but because they have to, right? Because we're all on the same globe. But essentially, you know, it's of course the system rival. And on the German side, it's interesting because Germany doesn't want to choose as much either, right? I mean, I think a large part of society sees China or China's disinformation, the system that's currently in China, you know, ruling China as a threat to the country's values. But overall, they bring good business, like you just mentioned.
They do.
And it's tough, especially with Germany and the US working so closely together. But then when it comes to China, it's tough to find a common strategy. So I can't even
also
imagine.
It's a fair reminder and fair question. It's a fair thing to say that the US and China do a lot of business together. They are number one trade partners with each other. And all of a sudden, smaller countries are a problem. I mean, the United States can do trade with China, but me, Georgia, cannot do trade with China because I don't know how to handle it right.
Like you said, Georgia is interested in joining NATO, of course, right?
Right.
So there's also that tension. I mean, how does the like Georgian society look at that? Is there like a priority between China's bringing in business, we should be prioritizing this? Or is it security concerns, we should be joining NATO?
It is such a difficult question. If you had asked me that question last year, I would say that NATO and EU are our number one priorities. 80% of the population support that, have supported that. Even the support to the Western organizations in Georgia have been much more significant than in Ukraine, frankly. I mean, Ukraine did not even have 50% support before the war broke out. So we've been Western-minded for a very long time, but things are changing.
Okay.
I see the government's rhetoric shifting. It has become increasingly anti-Western. We had attracted increasingly more Chinese investments in the country.
What would you, as a Georgian, say would help to better relations with a country such as Georgia that is developing an anti-Western rhetoric, right? What is it you think could help in that situation?
At this point, I think we need to educate ourselves a lot. Okay. I think this kind of programs, like what we're doing, just bridging this educational knowledges and getting out there the fact-based analysis is critical. But what I am seeing also on my YouTube channel is that a lot of people have made up their mind. And we need to remember that we are dealing with the post-Soviet populations. The Soviet Union is still there. They have been told that the West is a bad guy for a long, long time. And it just cannot flip overnight. You know, those people don't think that America, Europe can bring something much better than what they've witnessed before. And they take examples from Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, look at Americans ruining every part of the world where they are perpetrating warfare. Yeah. And frankly, that argument does not really help Americans, and American soft power is prominent at the same time. So those people have made up their mind. And I don't know how to solve that issue. You know, I feel like you have to be open-minded to want to educate yourself to be better. But if you've decided that the West is a bad guy and that's just the way it is, I don't know how to solve that issue. So I think one conclusion can be drawn from this conversation that people live in different realities and we might not always know about it. You know, we always walk in with our systems of beliefs and mindset, and we are aware that sometimes people are different. That happens if you're open-minded, right?
Yes.
Have you encountered something like that in your life when you feel like you live in a different reality while somebody else lives in a totally different world?
I studied in Berlin, and my university at the time offered a program where you could take a semester abroad in Russia. And I was specializing in U.S. statecraft and U.S. foreign policy, and I wanted to go see Russia with my own eyes, speak to the people. Once COVID allowed for it, I was able to go in 2021. So this is before Ukraine happened. So obviously we're living in a very different world at this point. Right. But I had a lot of interesting conversations when I was there. And essentially I think one that speaks to different realities was I was in a group of people, and I met these two women, and they introduced themselves to me, and they asked where I was from. So I said, I'm German and American, and, you know, currently living in Germany. And I asked them where they were from. And the one told me she's from South Ossetia.
Oh, my.
Yes. So I just, you know, I responded just the way I responded, because I had never met anyone from South Ossetia or Abkhazia, right? So this was very new.
I want you to clarify what is South Ossetia and what is Abkhazia.
Oh, I think actually, Khedivaan, I think this one's for you. You, as the Georgian,
that's
as
fair.
The Georgian,
That's
you need
fair.
to explain that for our American or international audience out there.
Right. So Georgia is actually a Russian-occupied country, right? Ukraine was not the first. Georgia was the first war in Europe in 2008. Russians attacked South Ossetia, but Abkhazia was even occupied before that. And these are the breakaway, self-proclaimed regions which try to be independent states, but in reality, these are Russian-backed secessionist movements that are not internationally recognized. So that's why we consider this as Russian occupation in Georgia. And I'm shocked to find out that you've encountered an opportunity to see a person from Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I've never met a single one of them.
Oh, that's fascinating to me as a Georgian.
There is an imaginary wall in between us.
I was about to ask. Okay. That's so interesting.
They cannot travel to Georgia.
So obviously realities were on the topic. You're very much confirming
Yeah.
what we're already saying. Wow, within our own country, and then, you're divided from them. Essentially, that's what my conversation kind of showed me as well. Like I said, I thought it was super interesting. So she said she's from South Ossetia. It's like, oh, wow, Georgia, I've never been. That's so interesting. And she's like, no, we're our own country. Russia recognized us. And it was just the strangest moment for me to be in, because was I going to say something? Essentially, what do you say? I grew up in two very different countries that have a very different belief system, that don't acknowledge South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and they're viewed as Russian occupation. However, this is her reality. To her family members,
that's
to
the
her
information
friends.
She's been fed.
Yeah, but that's also
how she knows it.
It's her reality for her, right? And it wouldn't matter what I would say. Not that I was going to say something. I was being hosted. It was still an evening with lovely, kind people. I had this unique opportunity to go abroad, and I also realized that the people from other countries in the room, a lot of them probably shared similar realities or understanding of borders, national borders, where they end, where they begin.
A lot of Russians in Ukraine think that they are liberating the east of Ukraine from the oppressor regime, right?
Exactly. And that's the same thing. It's realities. And I think it's interesting because when we see this on television or we talk about it being part of one side of the conflict, it seems far, or it seems so removed. And it's not until you have a one-on-one conversation with someone who believes this, whose reality this is, that just kind of puts everything into perspective for a second. That just makes you realize, how effective is messaging. When people, like what we said before, when you spread the message, democracy is a good system, human rights are good. Okay, are we credible when we say this? Would people believe this? Why would they not believe it? Have we given them reason not to believe it? And the answer is, of course, no country is completely clean. We all have blood on our hands.
I've never met a single person from there. And even if I did, I would not know what to say.
Yeah. I can't imagine, but at the same time,
do you tell them, no, you are actually fed this misinformation by Russians and you're occupied by Russians and taken away from us?
Yeah.
No, because they are not going to believe you. They're not going to listen to you. They think you are doing the propaganda of your own.
Yeah. And I think that's so unfortunate when that's within one's own country, right? That's essentially, because I think we see so much misinformation, so much propaganda when it's two systems against each other, Cold War, or, different countries. But when it's people who speak your language, who share so many cultural traditions with you, and you hear them say that about you, and like you just said, you've never met someone from South Ossetia. This is part of the country you grew up in, right? So it's crazy. Realities are so different.
Well, to be fair, I've met Ossetians, but I have never met someone who claimed they were from South Ossetia. I know Ossetians who think they are Georgians and live in Georgia because, part of my family is Ossetian. Yeah. But I've never met anyone who was like, oh, I'm from an independent country called South Ossetia. But I appreciate your awareness of Russian occupation and knowing that South Ossetia was a breakaway region, because I wonder how many people are going to learn that it's a thing from our podcast.
Yeah, it's, I think, obviously the focus right now is on Ukraine, and I think Crimea, having been in 2014, is just a lot closer, but you're right, it did start a lot earlier, and essentially also for Georgia, it's one of the main factors why Georgia is still very far from joining NATO. Right? Absolutely.
We have two breakaway regions where Russian peacekeeping missions are active. So
yeah,
we cannot join NATO at this moment.
Yeah.
But you brought up a very interesting topic. You were in Russia. How were you viewed as a German American citizen?
So the Russian view of Germans, I perceived it in conversations with others and also through some of my classes, is there's a lot of cultural points that Russia and Germany have in common. So there's a lot of Russian words that are very similar to German words. And also, you know, being in Russia, it felt very European, you know, it looked it felt very, culturally, it felt very
Did you
European.
study in Moscow?
I did study in Moscow and got the chance to travel a bit. Unfortunately, not as much as I wanted because of COVID. You know, it didn't feel foreign in that sense. Of course, you know, hearing Russian the entire time was very tough because I wasn't speaking Russian very well at the time, and that made it very different. But overall, it felt very European. I was always careful to say that I'm also American until I got to know someone, simply because I couldn't really assess at the beginning how strong propaganda against Americans was. Of course, anti-Western, and I assumed it was also going to be anti-American, but, you know, I like to approach every individual thinking, you know, people think for themselves, hopefully, not always the case as we know, but, you know, I like to approach every individual I meet with the assumption, I don't know what their opinions are, I hope they're open-minded.
I like that as something I'm going to keep in mind too. And,
you know, you have to approach it that way. I mean, I went to Russia as someone has two Western nationalities, right? I mean, Germany, again, part of the Soviet Union in it, right? There was a wall in my country. And I mean, here in the US side, it's the same thing, right? I mean, we had again, also I'm confusing people by saying we, meaning Americans, and then saying we and meaning Germans. So the struggle of binational people. You know, but I wanted to go, I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to understand what drives people to think a certain way. And I think that's something we need a lot more today. Like, I'm so grateful I had the opportunity to do so. I met a lot of very smart, been Russia too. People.
You know, yeah? I like your perception of saying that we need to travel, we need to get to know the situation. Yeah, I've been to Russia, and frankly, I was criticized for taking that step because, again, we are Russian-occupied. But just like you said, I wanted to know. I wanted to go there. I wanted to experience what it was like. I went to Moscow for a volunteer forum, which was organized by this Western Canadian company. It felt very familiar. Mm-hmm. I went to Moscow, and I was in one of the fanciest hotels, and I look out of my window, and I think I'm in the suburbs of Tbilisi, my hometown.
That's interesting.
That was a very shocking realization to me, that Soviet Union really took away this personality of individual nations, mm-hmm. even with architecture, because they were building the same kind of blocks and buildings and apartments to create this sensation that it's the same country.
Yeah.
And to be in a foreign country, which is so culturally different from Georgians, I mean, we are not Slavic whatsoever, you open your window and you feel like you're home. And that's when I realized how prominent the Soviet influence has been.
So what was your experience being in Russia as a Georgian when you would speak to people about where you're from? What is your reaction? How do you feel about that, talking to someone who's from the oppressor nation, essentially?
The first reaction is they are switching to Russian language. You know,
after you tell them.
Yes, after I say I'm Georgia, everybody's switching to Russian immediately because they assume that I'm fluent in Russian, which I am, or I used to be, because I have not used the language for a long time, and I have lost my ability to be a fluent speaker. I still speak Russian, of course, but a lot of my friends don't. Mm-hmm. We are not a Russian-speaking nation. We've never been, and even when you talk to older generations in Georgia, they don't speak like fluent Russian. They speak.
And that's also an active decision? Like an active decision to phase out the language? Like in your generation, for instance, if you say your friends partially don't speak Russian?
It is an active decision right now. But in previous generations, Russian has never been the national language of Georgia. We have our own language. It's one of the unique languages in the world. We have our own alphabet. And we've been always proud to have it and always determined to maintain it. So even under the Soviet rule, our schools were in Georgian, our books were printed in Georgian, and we've preserved that. If you speak to my grandparents and even my parents, I mean, my dad is an excellent Russian speaker, but my mom, not so much. They know enough to get by, you know, and you can hear the heavy Georgian accent and grammar mistakes, because we've never been a Russian-speaking country. Mm-hmm. But when I go to Russia or I encounter anyone who's from Russia, they assume that I speak Russian and they switch to Russian immediately. But younger generations don't speak Russian at all.
Okay.
I mean, it's been phased out, like you said. English is the second language of every Georgian now. It was my second language too, growing up. So the trends are really, really changing.
Yeah.
But the perceptions stay. You know, they think, oh, you're from the former Soviet space, therefore you must speak Russian.
Yeah.
And I think that tells you a lot about how Russians view you as a post-Soviet citizen.
Yes. It's also interesting. It reminds me a bit of the debate that went on in Germany when Russia annexed Ukraine, right? And started a full-scale war on it. In the German language, the capital of Ukraine is Kiev. And then, which is the Russian pronunciation, though, if I understood that correctly. And then people started making an effort to pronounce it Kiev, right? The Ukrainian way. So there was also, even being in Germany, speaking German, people were like, oh, we need to like make sure to not speak the language of the oppressor, right? We need to use Ukrainian now, because I guess essentially even there, the Russian pronunciation of the city was more prominent. Like people were just using that. So, overall, I think we all need to stay open-minded. We need to talk to people who are not of our opinion. It's good to talk to people that we disagree with, and it's important to meet them at an eye-to-eye level. No being condescending, no immediately dismissing what they believe, what their reality might be or not. We spoke about reality today, and I think essentially that's the only way we can combat societal divisions, polarization. You need to have, open ears and open heart, and be willing to have tough conversations. And I think if we all strive for that, then we're all doing the best we can in our societies today.
If I can come from a Russian-occupied country, and if I can go to Russia, you can talk to somebody you disagree with tomorrow. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, Khedvan.
Well,
this was great.
Thank you. Really. Pleasure has been all mine, and I hope our audience enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I want more people to know that there are more young people on the planet who think comprehensively, so that we have a better future tomorrow.
I appreciate you doing this. I think this is exactly what we need nowadays.
So if you're also wondering what the hell is going on in the world and you want to learn more about it, don't forget to subscribe and tune in. Great. Cut.